All right there, econ friends. Welcome back to our final video in our fiscal policy series. In this one, we're going to be talking about the deficit and the debt. Let's start off with just a broad idea. We know what expansionary fiscal policies are. We know that in a perfect world, we would avoid the lags. They would be counter-cyclical. We would use them at the right time. Expansionary policies, as we know, expansionary fiscal policies, number one, raise G, and number two, reduce tax. Those can work. However, there can be consequences. One consequence of these expansionary fiscal policies would be the impact that they have on the budget deficit and the national debt of our country. Okay, let's do some definitions. A budget deficit is the amount by which the government's spending exceeds government's tax revenues in a given year. Okay, so the government brings money in, the government spends money out. Anytime the government's spending exceeds its tax revenues, that government is running for that year a deficit. In contrast, a budget surplus, it occurs anytime the government's tax revenues exceed its spending. Now let's think about expansionary fiscal policy. We see the tools right here. Since expansionary fiscal policy increases the spending, meaning the money out is going up, while reducing taxes, meaning the money coming in is going down, these policies will increase the budget deficit. So it's critical to understand that expansionary policies, by increasing spending and reducing tax intake, expansionary fiscal policies will increase the budget deficit. Okay. A similar but a slightly different concept, they're related, is the national debt. People oftentimes use deficit and debt interchangeably. That's really incorrect. They're different. They're related, but they're different, okay? The national debt, which is also called the public debt, refers to the federal government's total indebtedness at a moment in time, okay? The national debt represents the total of budget deficits over time minus the surpluses. So in other words, imagine that a government in 1 year, a government starts today, okay? In year one, they run a deficit of $100. This is going to make their debt $100. Suppose in year two, they also run a deficit, this time of $200. Well, that new deficit adds to the existing debt, which takes their debt to $300. In year three, the government runs a deficit, let's say, of $50. That $50 shortage, which you know has to be borrowed, borrowing is debt, that $50 deficit gets added to the debt, and now the debt is negative $350. Let's say in year four, the government runs a surplus of $200. That surplus knocks down the debt because that extra money can pay down the debt, and therefore our debt now will fall to $150. So in other words, you can imagine that the government will accumulate debt by running deficits, and it will reduce debt by running surpluses. Okay. In general, governments will finance their budget deficits by borrowing. They will borrow money by issuing bonds, which, as you know from your reading, are in essence IOUs. More specifically, here in the States, the US Treasury, that's the agency, the US Treasury in times of deficit will borrow money by selling treasury bills or notes or bonds. Okay, those three terms just refer to the maturity. Both, well, all three, treasury bills, treasury notes, and treasury bonds, they're all forms of debt. They all are tools to borrow money. The naming differences only come from the maturity on them, with bills having a short maturity, notes a medium maturity, and the bonds a long maturity. Okay, but all three of those tools are ways to borrow money. So again, here in the States, in times of deficit, the US Treasury will borrow by selling this debt to either government agencies, to households. When you buy a bond, for example, to invest, to banks, who, as you know, oftentimes hold bonds as reserves, and increasingly to foreigners. We've seen a pretty dramatic shift in the last couple of decades with who owns the debt, and an increasing amount of the American national debt, the federal debt, is not owned by American citizens or institutions, but rather is held by either foreign governments or foreign households. Okay? What's really important is that you understand that the federal government will issue bonds to cover deficits. And then once you get that, I want you to make sure that you understand the connection between bonds and those federal market operations. Now, one of the ongoing big debates in economics today is about the real impact and the real burden of the national debt. And there's economists on both sides of the equation and economists in the middle. Some who say that the national debt is a critical thing that needs to be addressed immediately and that it can have massive long-term negative impacts. And others who say that the national debt, that the federal debt is not really a big thing, that it's manageable, that it's not worthy of crisis thinking, that it can be thought about in a more gentle long-term way. And then there's economists in the middle who weigh both the pros and the cons of the other sides and try to synthesize an argument. But what I want you to know is that it's an issue that's hotly debated, and that there's varying views on both the impact and the burden. Recent economic history in different countries has complicated this debate. Because, for example, we've seen countries like Ireland in the 1980s and Canada in the 90s that had really big debts and then took aggressive actions to reduce their spending, to slash their debt, and then in response had great growth after. So we've seen some countries deal with debt, handle it, get out of it, and grow from it. On the other hand, we've seen other countries, this includes Spain and Portugal, but really, and recently, most notably, Greece, that have struggled with debt. And instead of getting out of it and growing their economies, they have actually struggled to escape this really vicious cycle of debt, which leads to higher taxes, lower productivity, and economic stagnation. So again, there's beliefs on both sides. The debt is not a major issue and debt is a mission critical issue. And there's evidence from different countries recently that can be used to support both of those camps. I just want you to be aware of the overall debate. Another national debt issue concerns this idea of what we call the intergenerational transfer of income. The intergenerational transfer of income refers to the idea that debt that our government takes on today will have to be paid for and addressed by future generations of Americans, most of whom aren't even born yet. So the people who focus on the intergenerational transfer of income, another way of saying that we're spending money today that will have to be paid by our ugly grandkids and great grandkids in the future, Those people really focus on the idea of ethics, and they ask the question, is it ethical to saddle future generations with burdens so that we can enjoy life today? Again, another hotly debated topic, but it's one that I want you to think about, because you're going to hear, especially during election times, lots of different views on it. I want you to understand what deficits are, how they arise, and understand that there's a continuum, a level of discourse on different sides from different camps that take different views on the debt. Okay. To me, what's really been interesting, though, like I said here as of late, is this idea about the ethics of burdening future generations with payments based on spending today. Worth thinking about. I encourage you to. The final point I want to make is this. Back to our idea of public choice analysis, which, as you recall, was the use of economic thinking to understand and analyze political decisions. In other words, public choice analysis seeks to analyze the actions of politicians through the lens of economic thinking, like incentive and opportunity cost. With that said, I want to leave you with this. While the burden of the national debt is clearly a long-term issue, a multi-generational issue, part of the problem is that the incentives facing politicians are inherently short-term, short-run in nature. Most politicians, their incentives are not about looking 30 years, 60 years ahead. Their incentives are tied to the short-run realities of their next election. So we have these kind of conflicting incentives between politicians who are incentivized to think short-term, 2 years or 6 years or 4 years if you're a congressman or a senator or a presidential candidate, versus 30 or 60 years if you're looking at the long-run health of the economy. One of the glaring problems that many commentators see today is that we have these incentive imbalances between short-run political thinking and the need for long-run economic thinking. Okay. But the reality is, at least for now, that while the debt is a long-term issue, politicians face short-term incentives. We talked earlier about public choice analysis, and I'll leave you with this. As public choice analysis would indicate, today, politically motivated officials, AKA politicians, they will find debt to be highly attractive. While economists may differ on it, lots of politicians, lots of people running for office find debt very, very attractive, because debt will allow politicians to give voters immediate, visible benefits without having to impose on those voters any parallel visible costs. In other words, a politician will always want to and will always be incentivized to show their potential voters all the benefits of a policy, but to hide the cost of that policy. We know in economics that good analysis looks at cost and benefit openly, honestly, weighs them in a transparent manner. Unfortunately, most politicians don't face those same economic incentives. And in fact, politicians who are trying to get votes are often, not always, but often incentivized to show and provide immediate benefits to get those votes, but to downplay or even evade immediate costs, which voters don't like. Look at what debt does. Debt allows politicians to give prospective voters those immediate benefits, but kick the cost down the road. Next time you hear a politician talk about anything from student loan reduction to increasing spending to anything else in the middle, ask yourself, as public choice analysis would have you do, are these politicians being really honest and transparent about long-run economic thinking? Or are they thinking strictly in terms of providing you as a voter short-term benefits while hiding or ignoring the potential long-term cost? Okay. The last piece of evidence for that is that in the 59 years since 1960 in America, we have run 55 deficits as opposed to 4 surpluses. You would think that in a up and down business cycle with a lot of booms and busts that go on, expansions and contractions, we would want counter-cyclical policy and would have a pretty even layout of deficit versus surplus. But the data, as public choice analysis suggests, says otherwise. Again, in 59 years since 1960, we've run 55 deficits and only 4 surpluses. The incentives that politicians face are a part of that reason. Thanks for tuning in to this segment. Real quick, before you shut down, if you have a minute, check this site out, www.usdebtclock.org. Go to that site, and it gives you a slew of economic data, including the size of the federal deficit and the size of the debt. If you have 2 minutes, go to that site, check it out. And if you really want to be freaked out, every couple of minutes, click refresh and see how in even a short period of time, the size of the jump of our national debt. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you next time.